was at Inle Lake in Myanmar the past week and I took that picture. Now it's not a world-changing picture, it's not even going to be featured in a magazine, but I really liked it and there was a lot of positive responses around it, so I figured I'd make a video about how I got that picture. So this video is going to go through camera settings, but it's also going to go beyond that, just because I'd hate to make a video and then you guys go out and try it and then get terrible results because I didn't give you the full picture. So today we're going to look at most of the factors you're going to have to deal with when doing astrophotography with your Lumix G7 and actually just any other camera. As many of you guys know, in terms of media, I predominantly work in video, but for the most part, I'm a casual photographer. I do pay jobs for video, but never in my life have I accepted a single cent for my photography, so just bear that in mind when you're going through this video. So we all know Micro Four Thirds isn't the greatest system for low light situations because of the smaller sensor, there's going to be more noise, but that doesn't mean your Lumix G7, your G85, your GH5, or any other Micro Four Thirds camera can't do astrophotography. But astrophotography isn't an easy genre of photography to start with because there's a lot of factors that need to be considered before you can get a good shot. Now, to give you some context, the night I went out and took this photo, there were some clouds, but there weren't enough to bother me, so I still went out and shot. I was supposed to take a time lapse, but at the same time, the boardwalk was at a hotel I wasn't staying in. So yeah, I snuck in and the guard and I had a friendly conversation. Eventually, he just let me do my own thing. But I don't recommend you guys breaking into places you're not supposed to be in, but some kindness and some good conversation can go a long way. So some of the challenges I bumped into was that it was hard to find good composition because of the second problem, there was still too much light in the foreground. On top of that, the moon was coming up from the horizon behind me, so I knew I didn't have that much time. But when I finally found something decent at the very end of the boardwalk, I realized all this time that the boardwalk had just been freshly painted with varnish. So I'd been setting my camera down, I've been leaning on the railings, putting my hands on it, and I slowly started to realize that my hands were burning. So I panicked a little bit, I ran back to this hotel that I wasn't even staying in, went to the toilet, washed my hands, and the soap wasn't strong enough to get it off. So I knew then and there I needed to pack up really soon and get back to my hotel to deal with the situation properly. But as I was leaving the boardwalk, I realized that the composition was so much better at the front of the boardwalk rather than at the end. So I put my tripod back down, turned on my camera, I already had my settings ready, and basically after a couple of shots, I got this picture. After that, I ran back to the hotel, hands burning. True story. So the fact is, so many things have to go right just to get one good picture in astrophotography, and today we're going to talk about 6 things that you're going to need to deal with, 6 things that need to align to get a good picture of the stars. First and foremost is location, and this is probably the most important factor and the biggest factor as to whether your picture is actually going to be good or not. Now, the first thing I do is look at light pollution maps and see if the place I'm going to is relatively dark. The general rule is that the darker it is, the better it's going to be. The second thing you need to take into account is weather. Now, it can't be too rainy and it can't be too cloudy. And weather is probably the hardest thing to control out of this entire process because it could change up on you on the day that you're there. And if it does, then tough luck. But generally, look at the weather forecast, make sure you're going on a time and date that is not too rainy or too cloudy. Now, the third thing you need to pay attention to is time of the month. And this is in relation to the moon because the moon is a relatively bright light source and you don't want that ruining your pictures. So a simple Google search will just show the moon phases and the location that you're going to, and you have to try and plan to go there when the moon is darkest. However, if you've already booked your flights or you don't have a choice, you still have options. I use an app called Night Sky. It's a free app and there's an option to buy the premium version, but what this app lets me do in terms of this issue is to check where the moon is going to be at that time of night. Sometimes the moon rises really early, sometimes it rises a bit later, and so this app is going to help you plan around that. On to number 4. So once you've got the first 3 things down, now you're on to composition. What I like to do is I like to get some interesting foreground that says something about where I actually am. In the case of this photo, it was the boardwalk because at Inle Lake, this place is absolutely full of them, and it's a really integral part of the communities that live around that lake. Now, the second thing to do is to frame that foreground in an interesting way. Obviously, in this case, I just shot it straight on using these leading lines up into the stars, but I could have shot it sideways if I stepped away from the boardwalk far enough, but it's really up to you. It's really important to frame the foreground really well in astrophotography because that's a big part of your picture. Now in terms of foreground, I start with a really dark foreground and then maybe add light to it. Now obviously in this photo, I didn't really have a choice because there were already lights on the boardwalk, and that actually became a limitation. What I could have done is done a composite shot. So take 2 shots, one exposed for the boardwalk and one exposed for the stars, and then merge them later. As you can tell from the story of how I got this photo, I didn't really have that option. So another part of composition in astrophotography is the actual stars themselves. A lot of people like taking pictures of the Milky Way. That's really trendy. You don't have to. But if you wanted that option, you wanted to find the Milky Way, again, I'd turn to that app. Using this app, Night Sky or any other equivalent app, will help you find the Milky Way and point your camera in that direction. But remember, you don't need to shoot the Milky Way. The goal here is to get the prettiest picture of where you are. So it's a bit of read and react mixed with your creativity, rather than going in there with a preconceived idea of how you're going to take this picture. Now in terms of camera equipment, in terms of lenses, you'll want the widest angle lens that you have with the widest aperture that you have. Prior to this year, it was my 20mm 1.7, after that it was my 17mm 1.8, and now it's the Laowa 7.5mm f2. Now in terms of camera bodies, I just use my Lumix G7, but honestly any Micro Four Thirds camera released in the last 2 or 3 years is probably gonna do, but obviously the newer the camera, the better. Now in terms of tripods, I don't have any specific recommendations. I used an old man Frodo tripod for this one, but honestly anything that will hold your camera steady is gonna do. Remember that a lot of tripods have a hook at the center column, and if you don't think it's stable enough, just use your camera bag and hang it on that center column. That's gonna give you that extra stability. Okay, you've made it to number 6, congratulations, we're on to camera settings. So obviously for aperture, you'll want it as wide as possible. On my lens, that was f2. Now for shutter speed, there's an equation that you can use to calculate how long you can leave the shutter speed open without getting star trails. It's 500 divided by the focal length of your lens in full frame terms. So in my case, it was the 7.5 Laowa, that's a 15mm in full frame terms, so 500 divided by 15, that's about 33 seconds. So it's worth noting that in this picture, I actually took it at around 13 seconds or 15 seconds, I believe. I didn't use the full 33 seconds, I just ramped my ISO to 1600. Now it's worth noting that for this particular shot, I used a shutter speed that was around 13 or 15 seconds because the light on the boardwalk was already so bright. Another thing to note about high ISO and long shutter speeds is that it actually produces the same amount of noise. So if you thought you're going to save on noise by decreasing the ISO and compensating with shutter speed, you're actually not going to see too much of a difference. So in terms of ISO, I typically start at 1600 and move over to 3200 when I need to, but it really depends on your setup, it depends on your location. Feel free to experiment with this. Now, if you've never done long exposure before, you're going to notice that your camera is going to start lagging a lot in your viewfinder on your LCD. This is really normal. It's taking your camera that many seconds to gather all that exposure to show that visually to you. So don't worry, it's normal. Now in terms of focusing, flip it onto manual and go to infinity straight away. That's your starting point. Then move it back and try and focus on the stars. Now to help you with this, turn on peaking and turn on manual focus assist. Now before I take the shot, I flip the white balance to tungsten so that the sky has a bit of a blue tinge. You don't need to do this step, and obviously you can just change this in post, especially if you're shooting raw. And speaking of raw, because of the nature of this kind of photography, I recommend you always shoot raw for astrophotography, so keep that in mind. Anyways, that's basically it. I hope you guys have fun with this and get creative. I was actually going to include a section about how I edit these photos, but this video is starting to get really long, but if there's enough interest, maybe I'll make a future episode about this. In any case, I hope those 6 things helped you get more out of your Lumix G7, your Micro Four Thirds camera, or in fact, any other camera, and I'll see you guys next time.